So let's focus on the fuel pump body. That's this yellow part right here. As we were looking at the real carburetor, you probably noticed that I stuck my pen in this area here. And as I stuck it in, you could see it through here, and that indicated that the air going to the engine from outside through the air filter was coming past the carburetor. If we think back to what we learned before, Bernoulli's principle said an increase in velocity equals a decrease in pressure. The same thing happens right at this hole. Air is rushing past, and as air is rushing past, there's a low pressure area right there. Now, my diaphragm, this part right here, is sitting, pushing up against this cup and this spring in this hole right here. And so when air rushes past the hole, the rubber part of this diaphragm gets pulled in that direction towards the hole. That makes sense. Air rushes past. As air rushes past, a low pressure area is created, and that pulls the diaphragm towards the fuel pump body, compressing this spring. Okay, so we know that happens. What else happens then? Well, we know that this pump cover right here is bolted with all these little bolts all the way through the diaphragm and attaches to these holes right there. You can see that. And when it does, it pushes hard against so that it seals all the way around this diaphragm so air can't get in. We call this a diaphragm, and I talked about this in the first video, because the diaphragm under your lungs moves down and creates a vacuum on the other side. Well, the low pressure right here pulls the diaphragm in, and that means there's a low pressure area created over on this side of the diaphragm in this fuel cup right here. So low pressure pulls the diaphragm this way, and that pressure pulling the diaphragm that way creates a low pressure area in this space right here. That low pressure area pulls this flap up. When it pulls this flap up, the hole leads down to the tube that goes to the very bottom of the tank. So now I've got high pressure in the fuel tank. I have low pressure right here in this fuel pump cover. That causes the fuel to move up through this valve into this area, which is the same as this area because it's all bolted together. So now I've got a little pocket of fuel happening right there. So now let's go back and look at the air rushing past the fuel pump body. Because air just doesn't rush past there consistently. It only rushes past there when the piston is moving down in the cylinder on the intake stroke. So when the piston moves down on the intake stroke, it gets to the end and then starts to come back up on the compression stroke. That means momentarily air is not rushing past the diaphragm. And so the diaphragm spring pushes against the diaphragm, and when it pushes against the diaphragm, that little bit of fuel that was inside there pushes outside the other valve that is hidden right here through this passage here down into the fuel cup. My fuel cup is sitting right here, and it just fills it up. Air rushes past the fuel pump body. Bernoulli's principle says a low pressure area occurs in this hole. That pulls the diaphragm towards the fuel pump body and creates a low pressure area in the fuel pump pocket. That low pressure area, combined with a high pressure area at the bottom of the tank, causes fuel to move up the tube through this hole, filling up the pocket. The intake stroke is done. On the compression stroke, air is no longer rushing past the fuel pump body. The fuel pump spring pushes out on the diaphragm and pushes the fuel that was in this fuel pump pocket down through the lower valve into the fuel cup. All ready for what we talked about earlier, drawing that fuel up into the path of the air and then ready for combustion. And now there's only one more thing to add. When the piston is going down on the intake stroke, we need to remember that when the engine is running at 2000 RPM, that means there are 15 intake strokes happening every second. That means this diaphragm is moving in, sucking fuel in, and out, pushing the fuel down into the fuel cup 15 times a second. When it happens that fast, it fills up that fuel cup really quick.